Hello everyone, and welcome to our second lunch bar of the day. If you haven't already, then grab yourself some food. It's good to see so many of you. I'm Mark.
I'm Jamie.
And yeah, we'll be your host for this session.
I think we're just going to try and get started real quick, so we've got time for a Q&A. There will be a Slido up this whole time, so if you do get questions throughout the talk, send them straight in and we'll discuss those afterwards. If you really like a question, upvote it so that we answer it quickly. I'm going to invite Steve up now. He's a postdoc working at Nottingham. He's a research fellow there. He's working in physics and he's here to talk to us today. I'm going to give you my mic, it's the better one.
Hello everyone. We're awake.
So, if you were here yesterday, you might know a little bit about Steve already. But Steve, I want to ask you, what is one thing that people might not know about you that's really interesting?
Okay, something that's really interesting. Now the speaker who was here before said that he's been on Pointless, which I've got nothing as extravagant as that. Interesting fact about myself, how about this? I can juggle knives. And I used to do it and get paid to do it. Yeah.
It's very impressive. Right, well, looking forward to hear what you have to say.
All right, brilliant. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to this talk. This day, throughout the Week of Wonder, we're asking about well-being. And the previous session, we were looking at a cure for stress. So hopefully these talks are going to go online at some point, so you can pick up that one if you missed it. But for this session, we're answering this question. How do I find meaningful connection in an isolating world? Now, we're really familiar with the term isolation at the moment, aren't we? Because we hear isolation all the time. Why? Because of COVID, yeah. So we know this idea of you get the disease, the virus, and you have to stay indoors for a week or 7 days or 5 days. And obviously we've just found out that the government haven't been doing that. But anyway, we know this word isolation. And what this question is driving at is this feeling of loneliness and isolation that we can have in our day-to-day experience. And of course, COVID has made us very separate from each other at times. We haven't been able to be in each other's presence. We've had to see each other through a screen in those annoying online sessions, and I'm sure you've experienced that with classes and with friends and with family. And it was really hard, wasn't it? It was really quite difficult during that time. Many people felt very lonely and found it very difficult. But actually, it's not just COVID that has led to people feeling loneliness. The fact is that even aside from COVID, our society here in Britain is rampant with people who really struggle with loneliness and isolation. Now, there's a great charity that I'd encourage you all to look at in your spare time called Campaign Stop Loneliness, and I just went to that website preparing for this talk, and I want to show you some stats for us here in the UK. So if we can move on to the next slide. Actually, I can do that. Here we go. Now, you might not be able to see that, but here's an infographic of some of the stats relating to isolation. 92% of people find it difficult to say that they struggle with loneliness. 8 out of 10 people feel judged negatively for feeling lonely. 92% of people think that people are scared to admit when they feel loneliness. So people are scared to say it if they feel it, and maybe that's you this afternoon. You felt this, but you just haven't shared it with anyone. It's really hard, isn't it? 7 in 10 people said that they know a friend who is lonely and feels the pain of that. But it doesn't just affect the way we feel internally, it affects our mental health. 64% of people are likely to develop depression if they've gone through feelings of loneliness. And not only our mental health, but also physical health. There's an increased chance of developing dementia if you struggled with loneliness throughout life. And you're more likely to get heart disease. It's got a similar risk factor to smoking 15 cigarettes a day, the stats show. And here's one of the most horrific stats right down there in the bottom corner. 13% of us Brits feel lonely all the time. 13%, that's 1 in 10 people. That means if this room was representative of Britain, there'd be a whole swathe of us, 10% of us, 13%, who would be struggling with loneliness. And so this issue is actually a really difficult one. The stats are scary, aren't they? But the statistics don't fully capture how hard and difficult this situation, if you go through it, is. I've been through periods in my life when I have felt loneliness, but it hasn't taken over me. But I have friends who have been deeply despairing because of the loneliness and isolation that they feel, not because of COVID, just because of their relationships in the world. And it has led to one of my very good friends to a very deep depression that she can't get out of, and then it cycles because her depression stops her from going out and making those connections, which makes the loneliness worse and feeds back into her depression. It really is a difficult situation, and I'm sure as I look out here that there are many of you here who will have a family member or a friend or maybe yourself personally, and you have struggled with this issue. You've seen how it's impacted you internally, your mental health, your relationships. And so this question today is an incredibly important question. How do we find meaningful connection in an isolating world? Now at this point, if you're not a Christian and you've just come in, by the way, you're very welcome, and I hope you use this week to explore and think some of the things we're saying. But you might be wondering, well, why are the Christian Union putting on an event about this? It's a little bit like the author Douglas Murray, where he accuses Christians of doing Jesus smuggling. He'll talk about something and they'll smuggle Jesus into the conversation. Is that what's going on this week as we look at this question? Well, look, that's not what I want to do. That's not what I want to come across this morning, this afternoon. But I do want to say today that there is something that Christianity, that the message of Jesus offers, that does speak into this question of loneliness and finding meaningful connection in this world. I want to be really clear. I'm not saying that if you become a Christian, suddenly you don't struggle with depression or loneliness. And I'm not saying that Christians have all the answers and it's a joyous ride as long as you believe it. I'm not saying that. But I am saying there's something very important that is to be said from the point of view of the Christian. In fact, I want to go further than that. And I want to say that the pervading view of society in the West today is actually it actually doesn't help on this issue, and sometimes can make it worse. We talked a little bit about this yesterday, but the pervading worldview of our day is that the world is purely physical, and that we have to somehow find our own meaning in life, that there's nothing higher or more valuable, there's no God out there in which we can find meaning and truth. We're just accidental outworkings of a long and treacherous evolutionary history with no deeper meaning. That's the pervading view in the world today. And even if you haven't adopted that or haven't really thought about it, it's likely you may have absorbed that worldview. So, throughout this talk, I'm going to highlight a few things that I think Christianity speaks into this point. I'll be quite brief. And I'm going to keep contrasting it to the world's view that you may have absorbed from the culture around. And I want you just to test it in your mind and to ask if it makes sense, if there is something to be said for it. Because our desire this week at the Week of Wonder is for you guys to explore these questions for yourself. To take a book from the stand. I found out today they're free, by the way. Take a book from the stand. To speak to someone who's talked out the front, or one of the Christian Union members here, just to explore these issues for yourself and ask, do they make sense of the world I live in? And do they help on some of these deeper issues? So here we go. Here's 4 things that Christianity believes, that the worldview that Jesus believed says, that I think helps with this question. Okay, here's the first thing. Christianity says that meaningful connections is fundamental to who we are. Meaningful connection with other people is fundamental to who we are. Now, in Christianity, we believe that at the root of all being, there is God. Maybe you don't believe that. But bear with me for a moment. Within Christianity, we believe in something called the Trinity. We all will know that term. And what the Trinity is that in God, there are 3 persons that are in a loving relationship with each other. So right at the source of all meaning and all purpose, if there's a God there, what is he like? The answer in Christianity is that he is in relationship. He is a community, a group of persons who are in meaningful connection with each other. So right at the source of all existence is meaningful connection. And more than that, if you read the Bible and you look at the Christian narrative, what we see is that God makes humans. Again, you might not believe that. And he just makes one to begin with. His name was Adam. Okay, Adam. That's the story. That's how the story goes, isn't it? But do you know what the first thing that God said about humanity was? The first thing. The first thing we read that God said about humanity is this: it is not good that he is alone. It is not good that he's alone. So he made Eve, and then the rest is history. So right at the heart of the Christian message, not only is God someone who's loving in community, but also humans, we need it. It's part of our spirituality and who we are, to have that connection with other people, other minds from different backgrounds, together as one. That connection is important. And just for a moment, contrast that with the mainstream physicalist view. Okay, according to that story, the world is just physical and we got here through evolution. We're social animals, right? It's important we're in society, that's what it says. But ultimately, the name of the game in evolution is survival. That's the name of the game. So if you want to just live for yourself, go and do it. See how that contrasts to the message of Jesus, which says we are made to be connected to other people. And if you don't have that connection with others, it's going to affect you spiritually, internally. That's the first thing. Here's the second thing. Christianity believes that God wants us to love and care for the excluded. Now, if you read through the Bible, there's lots of difficult parts. It's a really hard document to read. But what you'll start to notice is that when God speaks the laws and the commands to the people on earth, right at the center of that is this idea that those that are excluded in society should be brought in and included. The poor, the needy, the widows. And this is exactly what we see in the life of Jesus. If you read the story of him and take one of these books that are on your table, because that's just one of the stories of the life of Jesus, you'll see that he just gives himself to include the outcast, the unwelcomed. And the teachings of Jesus, where Jesus said, actually the only way you're going to get to be God and please God is if you welcome the poorest and the weakest in society, the most excluded, the ones that aren't the famous and the rich and the well-known and the popular. And we see this in the early church. If you look at the story of how Christianity started, it was a nothing religion full of poor people. They didn't have power at the beginning. But they stood out to the culture around because they would include the people in society that were normally excluded. In fact, one of the incredible things is one of those groups were the women. In society, in pagan Roman culture, the women weren't allowed to have position and have respect in the way that they found it in the Christian church. So in the early church in the first century, women would come in because they would find meaning and purpose in the church. But it wasn't just them, it was all sorts of people. The way the church cared for the weak in society mattered. So this matters because if you're sitting here and you're a Christian, the challenge is that you need to be looking out for and drawing in those who are most excluded. You need to be acting towards those who are struggling with loneliness. And by the way, if you're a Christian here and you're not doing that, well, shame on you, because that is the calling. Now contrast that with a physicalist worldview. Why should I care about the excluded and the weak? If it's about my survival ultimately and my success, why shouldn't I just live for my own riches and my own sake? No, Christianity grounds us with this important requirement that we don't exclude those in society who are like that. And that's been the story of Christianity. Okay, third thing. In the Christian worldview, the belief is that there is a God who loves you and he wants a meaningful connection with you. Now you might think, why is that important? I can't see God, I can't feel him, so what's that got to do with anything? But you see, I think this is crucially important. And I see this in my own family's life. Now I've got 3 children, one who's 3, one who's 5 and one who's 7. And my youngest, my middle child, called Jesse, he really struggles with shyness, with being able to go out and speak to people. And I remember struggling with that when I was his age. And I wouldn't want to talk to anyone, I'd want to hide away, and I'd sort of self-isolate through my own shyness. But do you know what made the difference for me, and what I think is going to make the difference for Jesse? It's him knowing that he is loved and accepted by me and my wife. When you feel that love from the one that is above you, from the source, when you feel and know that love for yourself, it empowers you to be able to connect with others. And you know, this lies right at the heart of the Christian message. The Christian message is not about making us religious, making us rule followers. It's about us understanding that there's a God out there who loves us and cares for us and wants a connection with us. And that's what Jesus was all about, how you can find that connection with God. So this makes all the difference. The physicalist account does not have anything above us, any source, any ultimate value that loves us. And the final thing, in Christianity, connection with Jesus leads to connections with others. Now Jesus loved talking about this when he was on the earth. And he'd use illustrations like this. He'd say, look, I'm like a vine, like a tree. And when you connect into me, you're like a branch. And what he was saying was, you become one together when you connect into me. And so in the early church, the first followers of Jesus, they came from all kinds of backgrounds, and people that didn't get on with each other, people that were racist and judgmental towards each other, who discriminated each other. They came into the church, they became Christians and planted themselves in Jesus. And then we read that they are now one, connected, because of Jesus. And I go to a church in Leicester, which is where I live, and it's a very multicultural area of the city. And you know, in our little church community, there's about 40 or 50 of us. We have people from India and Nigeria and America and Algeria and Egypt and England and Wales. All those different backgrounds. But when we come together, we have that connection with each other because of Jesus. So Christianity offers this thing. If you come in, if you find Jesus, you're going to automatically know this connection with other people. Now, I'm not saying Christians don't struggle with loneliness, because lots of churches do this wrong. But if they're following what Jesus said, that's the connection that is found and felt. Look, what I've tried to do is just outline 4 simple truths about Christianity that I think help in this question. And they help in a way that the pervading worldview of today, that our culture will say that we get, that we just absorb every day, doesn't help with, and potentially leads to this loneliness that we see. I just want to finish with maybe more of a practical note before we get to questions, where I'm sure many of you will want to come back at me and say, that makes sense. I'm happy to answer that. But let me just finish with something really practical. Look, if you are struggling with loneliness at the moment, or if you know someone and you're trying to think, how can I help that person? I want to encourage you. You know, there's lots of things you can do to help, and I want to encourage you to go to the resources, the expertise online that can help with that, to take it seriously and to find out how you can help with that. But I also just want to encourage you, why don't you, or you take your friend, go along to a church. Even if you don't believe it, even if you think it's a waste of time, even if you think it's absolutely crazy, why don't you just go along and just see what it's like? Now, you may go to a terrible church, in which case this advice isn't great, but in many churches you'll find a community of people that will welcome you, that will love you, and where you will be able to find that meaningful connection with others. And that will help in your struggle, in your search to find meaningful connection. Alright, I'm going to finish it there. Thank you all for listening, and sorry if I didn't fully answer the question in the right way. I'm going to hand back over now.
Hello. Perfect. We're going to go through some questions now. If you want to send them in, Slido, can we get the Slido back up? Slido's there. We did have a question earlier, which is no longer on there. Someone asked, can you derive God from science? That's something we went over a lot yesterday, something that 2 talks were on yesterday. They weren't recorded, so you won't be able to look back at them, but Steve and Chris both talked on those topics. If you want to ask them these questions, that's fine. The most upvoted question is, why do I have to be a Christian to care about the excluded?
Okay, that's a great question, and it will allow me to clear up maybe a misunderstanding. Now, it's obvious, isn't it? You don't have to be a Christian to care for the excluded. And there are huge and important charitable efforts by people from all different backgrounds and none. But what I'm saying is, for the Christian, and for other religions as well, mainly mainly, but for Christians there is something fundamental about what we believe that forces us to override our natural inclination to maybe live for ourselves. And it gives us this drive and this motivation because there's this higher value thing that we're living for, which is God and what He's told us. And I think the problem with just pure naturalism is there isn't that higher value thing. The highest valuable thing is yourself, really, in naturalism. So you can have that effort, but I would say it's despite what you believe. You're just doing it because you have that desire and that effort, which is great. But what's going to drive you when you're tempted to just go and live selfishly?
The next question is, why should I pick the Christian community as a cure for loneliness over other communities?
Okay, that's a really good question. And I've been to a number of different religious places of worship, and so I've experienced other places, and I'm sure you'll find great community in lots of places. So in a sense, my advice could have been, just go along to any place of worship, you know, any faith background. What I would say is that Christianity has something at its root, and come and disagree with me on this if you want, that is different from the other religions, and that is Trinity, what I said. That God fundamentally is relational. No other religion says that He's fundamentally relational. And so that means that it's the foundation of everything a Christian and a church community should be practicing. And if you go to a church and you don't feel welcomed, I think that's one of the most damning things you can say about a church, because it's relational at its core. So that would be my little plug towards Christianity, but I'm obviously not meaning to offend anyone who has different religious practices, and you know, we can find meaningful connection in other communities for sure as well.
And similar to that question, we got another one that's just popped up, which is to do with why Christianity and not just Jesus and the Bible. Can't we have and give love without religion or God? Can't we admire the teachings of Jesus and be good people, but not want to do it just to go to heaven?
So I think there's a lot of angles to that question, actually. It's quite a complicated question. I mean, on one level, yep, you can just have your own personal faith and believe in Jesus and what He said and want to live it, and that's great. I would say when you read the New Testament, the emphasis it puts on the importance of the church is massive. Like, it's central for a Christian to God's plan for the world. Diversity, diverse people coming together in unity. That's central to God's plan for the world. So I don't think you can detach yourself from that and fully get the whole picture. And then I would just challenge you, like, if you want to do that, just make it personal, not go to church or do any of that sort of stuff. Well, actually, it could be really important for other people that you go to church. It could really bless and help other people for you to go into that place and be welcoming and have that unity there. So it's all well and good saying, well, I can live a good life and do it on my own, but maybe you need it in the church, and there's a selfless act to do that for you. Sorry if you found that offensive.
There's a question above here that I really like, and I'm going to expand on it as well with my own question. When I don't like some things about someone, what things could help me generate connection? Or if, as a Christian, if you don't get on with someone who is also a Christian, how do you have that connection?
Okay, that's great. So, yeah, the truth about church, you don't get on with everyone. It's not like you turn up and, yeah, we're all holding hands and skipping and dancing around a fire. And, it's not like that. So there's obviously dispute. I think, so a couple of things as a preamble, not very practical, but reminding ourselves of the truth that God wants unity. That's really helpful. Christians, we have the practice of prayer, so praying for help from God in that situation. But on a practical level, I don't think God is saying you need to be best friends with everyone. There's going to be some people you click with, some people you don't, and that's absolutely fine. But I think He is saying make an effort to look out and include those that are normally excluded, or look for those that are struggling with loneliness and try and find ways to bring them in and make that connection with them. And I think there is a shared humanity that like we all have. You know, you don't need to go far if you just keep asking and keep searching, do an activity together, you know, all the little things like that, where that connection will be found.
Naomi, this is the last question. It's the most upvoted. How do I connect with a God I can't see?
Okay, that's great. I'd be really interested to know if that was written by a Christian or a non-Christian. It is hard. It's one of the things I struggle with the most in my walk with God. I can't see Him. What I would say is connection with God. I mean, the key thing for the Christian faith is that Jesus brings that connection. In fact, He said to people around, look, if you've seen me, if you know me, then you know God. And that makes all the difference, because you can read about Jesus' life, you can see how He lived, you can follow His example, you can listen to His teachings, and just by doing that it will bring you into connection with God, because Jesus shows and reveals God to us perfectly. So explore. If that was written by a Christian, get to know Jesus more. Like, read books about Him, watch stuff on YouTube about Him, listen to preachers that inspire you about Him. If you're not a Christian, you wrote that, well, I'm going to say the same thing. Take one of these books home, read about His life, look at who He was. And for many people, what happens when you do that is just God just jumps off the page and connects into your heart. And I know that might sound soppy and spiritual, but it does happen. So please go and do that. Explore it critically, but explore it.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you so much.